Okay, here we are at our last lecture for the summer term for History 103. And today, as you can see, we're going to be talking about the end of the Cold War, and then we're going to talk about globalization and bring it a little more contemporary. So when we left off talking about the Cold War, we were talking about the high points of the Cold War, the 50s, 60s, even a little bit into the 70s. And in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets seemed to be well ahead of the United States, especially in terms of technology development. In many respects, it seemed to kind of have the momentum of history on their side, since China and Cuba had come on board the sort of communism train, and the US didn't seem at this point particularly successful at stopping the Soviet influence around the globe, especially in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Not to mention, the Soviets had seemed to really set the pace of the space race and technological development. And yet, in less than 30 years, the Soviet Union falls apart to be replaced by its core political unit of Russia and a host of newly independent former Soviet republics. So the question I'm asking in this lecture is, how in the world did the Soviet Union fall? If you time traveled back to like the late 60s, early 70s in the United States, most Americans probably would say, no, the Soviets, they'll never fall, they're winning. And yet, by 1991, the Soviet Union is done. So why and how does this happen so fast? Well, the Soviets had some problems in the 60s that the US was not really aware of until much later. Now, we talked about Nikita Khrushchev before, and he's the one who took power after Stalin died, and then we had talked about Brezhnev after him. But Khrushchev had set about retracting many of Stalin's policies. Remember, we talked about the thaw last week. While he had developed a kind of earthy, peasant-flavored popularity in the Soviet Union and on the international stage, his initial success in rolling back some of the worst abuses of the Stalinist period had been overshadowed by two big failures in the three big failures in the early 60s. The first was allowing something known as the Sino-Soviet split in 1960. Khrushchev's easing of tensions towards the US and the West, coupled with his lack of notice to Mao, in charge of China, about his denunciation of Stalin, led Soviet advisors to pull out of China. Basically what happened is China, under the control of Mao, still very hardcore communist, did not really like how Khrushchev and the Soviets were backing away from that, and it led to this split between the two, when had they continued to work together, they would have been stronger together. The second big failure under Khrushchev is the building of the Berlin Wall, which we talked about last week. Now, yes, it was effective at stopping the flood of refugees seeking to escape the Soviet satellite states, but it was a propaganda failure. His American counterpart, John F. Kennedy, had rallied the world opinion against the wall. So this is just hugely embarrassing for Khrushchev. And the next key blunder by Khrushchev was that in the Soviet Union, it looked like he just backed down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember that the Soviets sought to support Cuba and to test the resolve of JFK by placing missiles on the island of Cuba. Both sides had backed down. The Soviets removed their missiles, and the US promised never to invade Cuba ever again. But to the Soviets, it appeared that Khrushchev had really mollified the US, and this ultimately caused him to be ousted from power in 1964. So there's a lot of internal upheaval and problems going on in the Soviet Union that, again, the US is not necessarily aware of until much later. Now, by the end of the 1960s, the US and the Soviet Union had entered into a period known as détente. This is a period of relatively tranquil relations. It comes from the French term for the release of tensions. So things have gotten really crazy in the 60s, Cuban Missile Crisis, almost nuclear war. By the end of the 60s, both countries had realized, whoa, if we don't back off, we're going to go into a nuclear holocaust, and nobody wants that. Now, remember last week we talked about how the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the two nations ever came to nuclear war. The experience had shaken both nations, and to avoid future similar problems, they signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in October of 1963. Both were aware of the toxic effects of nuclear fallout and the possibility that future nuclear tests might raise false alarms about an actual attack. So the signatories to the Test Ban Treaty agreed to abandon all above-ground nuclear testing. Non-nuclear nations were severely discouraged from developing their own nuclear weapons in subsequent non-proliferation treaties. Additional safeguards were built into the detection and early warning systems both sides used as part of their missile defense. So this is part of this backing up, right, leading to détente. Like, if we aren't careful, we could lead the world into a nuclear holocaust. During the 70s, the United States sought to counter the overwhelming conventional power of the Soviets, namely that the Soviets had way more people, they had a way bigger army. If there was to be a ground war, the Soviets would have the advantage. And so the US sought to check that balance of power with medium-range ballistic missiles armed with the new technology of the neutron bomb, a nuclear weapon designed for minimal blast damage but maximal radiation lethality. So the idea here was that such weapons would leave many structures intact but devastate the personnel of an invading army. So this is how the US is trying to counter the army strength of the Soviets. A historic agreement was reached in 1979 that required the US and Soviets to limit certain types of nuclear weapons and begin a process of actually reducing them. The argument was, we all have way more nuclear weapons than we could ever use. Let's start to limit them and get rid of some of them. And this process became known as START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks or Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Now, this feeling of progress was checked when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979. Now, the Soviets do this because they're really concerned about the balance of power in the Middle East. There had been a treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979. The Saudi Arabia and Iraq were kind of leaning more to the US. And the Iranian Revolution had altered the Middle Eastern landscape radically in favor of the West. So the Soviets are getting really scared that they don't have any power in the Middle East. The Middle East is all turning to the US. And they become really afraid of having a weak, nominally communist Afghani government kind of to its south. And they're concerned that if Afghanistan starts to turn to the West, much the way Pakistan and China seem to have done, they thought they were going to lose everything in the Middle East, any sort of power base. So the Soviets launched a swift coup in Afghanistan and installed a strong communist leader with a massive military force to back him up. The Soviets were immediately subjected to international condemnation, and the United States announced that it would boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics scheduled to take place in Moscow. Now, there was substantial resistance to the Soviets, which was led chiefly by idealistic Afghan Muslims and an increasing large volunteer force of mujahideen armed with small arms that were funneled through NATO countries. They fought the Soviets for a decade. This war goes on until 1989. And we'll see this is really important because this 10-year war is really expensive for the Soviets. Really, really expensive. The US will help funnel in weapons and money to the resistors because it's the Cold War. And as we talked about in our last lecture, the US will support pretty much anybody who's fighting against the communists. And that's why when American soldiers went into Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, they found American weapons from about a decade before that had all been sent in to fight the Soviets. Now, on the United States front, the new administration of President Ronald Reagan sought to adapt a more aggressive policy towards the Soviets. Reagan really will distance himself from a policy of détente. And his administration felt that the previous president, Jimmy Carter, had been too soft towards the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. At the same time, breakthrough technologies in computers and satellite communications made it theoretically possible for the US to create an anti-ballistic missile system in outer space. Such system was in violation of the anti-ballistic missile provisions of agreements made in 1969, but the advantages of having a reliable missile defense hundreds of miles in space, while at the same time retaining first strike capability, were overwhelming to American defense planners. And thus, over Soviet protest, the US developed its Strategic Defense Initiative, more commonly known as Star Wars. Yes, that Star Wars, named for the film franchise that had recently come out at that time. From the mid-1980s, both superpowers thus began an enormously expensive strategic arms race. For the Soviets, the drain of the money of this new arms race, combined with the very expensive and unpopular war in Afghanistan, would prove unsustainable for the Soviet Union in the long run. Now, when Brezhnev died in 1982, there were two short-lived successors before the relatively young Mikhail Gorbachev took office in 1985. He was in his early 50s, which was pretty young for a ruler at that time. And he was faced with growing dissent in the Eastern European countries, an inefficient economy, an endless war in Afghanistan, and the expensive arms race with the US. And so Gorbachev called for large-scale reforms. I mean, he was smart. He saw the writing on the wall. He knew that the Soviet Union could not continue at the pace that it was going. Now, the problem for the Soviets in terms of their economy was that they never had accurate production figures, since both workers and managers had every incentive to over-report what they were producing and to produce crappy consumer goods, manufactured as cheaply as possible. What was happening was that this started during the Stalinist period and continued on throughout the rest of the 20th century, was that leaders, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, etc., said, this is how much I want you to make of X product. So for the purposes of this, we'll say, I want 100 units of toilet paper. And so the toilet paper manufacturers would say, okay, that's what we're supposed to make. Well, if you didn't make 100 units of toilet paper in this case, you would be sent off to jail. So this encouraged managers to over-report. So they'd say, yep, we hit our goal, 100 units of toilet paper. Well, maybe in reality, they only made 50 units. Well, that means they're shipping out their only 50 units to stores across the Soviet Union. That means there's never enough of anything. So in the Soviet Union, you could go to the store, like these women in the picture are, and maybe there's only toilet paper that day and nothing else. Maybe you go to the store and there's only bug spray. Maybe you go to the store, there's only bread. It's not like a grocery store like what you're thinking of, where you walk in and there's an assortment of all the goods you need. And this was all because of over-reporting production numbers, because the state basically threatened you that if you didn't do this, you'd go to prison. So you're going to tell them, yeah, I did it. So there's massive amounts of shortages all the time and really crappy goods. I mean, what they were making cheaply and fastly to try to meet these really crazy production numbers. So what you were buying was never really good in quality. In fact, if you talk to anyone who grew up in the Soviet Union or one of the Eastern Bloc states, they'll talk about how one of the number one things they wanted was Levi's jeans, because the jeans made in the Soviet Union were really crappy, and Levi's jeans from the US were seen as this amazing thing. And so they were traded on the black market for sure, but it was really hard to get a hold of them. The saying on the factory floors, and this gives you an idea of the problems with the Soviet economy, was they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. Not really a great economic system, as it turns out. By the mid-1980s, Soviet planners realized this has become a real problem. Industrial growth had slowed to only 3% in 20 years. So Gorbachev launched his two trademark economic and political programs in response. The first is Perestroika, which was the restructuring of the Soviet bureaucracy and the economy to make it more efficient and responsive to market demand. So he's trying to make it a little bit more capitalist without going full-on capitalist. And the second was Glasnost, which means openness. So this means more openness with the press, more openness in what books you can read, what books you can publish, what you can talk about. It's important to remember that up to this point, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state where you couldn't even speak freely in your own home without the threat of arrest. So glasnost, allowing more openness, is a big deal. And both of these were intended to revitalize communism, not to get rid of it. Now, the catalyst for glasnost was the nuclear accident in Chernobyl in the Ukraine in April 1986. Basically, the nuclear reactor in Chernobyl goes nuclear and destroys everything, absolutely destroys the entire city of Chernobyl. I would absolutely recommend looking up images of what Chernobyl looks like today. It's haunting. I mean, people aren't going to be able to live there. It's something like 5,000 years. That's how bad the radiation is. But it was impossible to conceal the magnitude of this disaster, the way the Soviet Union had covered up so many other things. And so reporting in the media became really honest and truthful for the first time, possibly ever, in the Soviet Union. And with glasnost, this was encouraged, and then people started talking about other stuff they hadn't really been able to talk about publicly in a very long time. Now, the end of the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union begins with East Germany, where there were massive demonstrations that led to the fall of the first communist government and also led to the fall of the infamous Berlin Wall on the night of November 9th, 1989. A year later, with Gorbachev's blessing, the two Germanys united after half a century apart. The Berlin Wall, as the physical symbol of communism's attempt to shut off Eastern Europe from the West, was physically torn down. Now, there are still parts of it up as a testament to this period of history, but most of it's gone. Now, here are some great pictures of people jumping up onto the wall. This is something that, days earlier you would have been shot by the Eastern German police for doing. Here's again people standing on the wall. This is again a huge moment for world history, also for German history. Absolutely huge. Now, communist nations fell very quickly after this, as it became clear that just like the collapse of empire, the collapse of the Soviet Union they couldn't hold these nations any longer. They didn't have the money to send in the army like they did in the 60s. The governments of the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania fell very quickly, as well as Bulgaria, Albania. Again, you can see all 15 satellite states became non-communist by the early 1990s. Now, Romania will take a little bit longer, but eventually it will also end their communist regime as well. So this is huge. I mean, this happens like a domino effect very, very quickly after East Germany kicks out the communists. And this kind of spells the end for the Soviets. Now, the first legitimate elections in the Soviet Union see Gorbachev lose power and see the election of Boris Yeltsin elected as the first president of Russia. As you can see, he will be president until 1999. You definitely know the person who followed him. The person who followed him was Vladimir Putin, still president of Russia today. Now, officially, the Soviet Union ended on Christmas Day, 1991, and was replaced by a democratic Russia with Yeltsin in charge. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, even though Russia is nominally a democracy, the decades of corruption are not so easy to overcome. And just like the newly independent colonies we saw in the first lecture of the week, political change is rife with difficulty. It's never easy. And Russia's transition has been fraught with corruption, tension with former enemies, all of which we're still seeing today. Some historians argue that Russia's relatively recent attempt to take the Ukraine was not so much a demonstration of power, but really a last gasp of the Soviet Union and of empire, arguably. So if you're answering that essay question, you should definitely talk about that. The problem for Russia is that they had no basis for democracy. Before this, Russia had only had a couple of months of democracy in 1917. They don't have any history. And democracy requires that you participate. It requires that you vote, that you think for yourself. And in Russia, that had been beaten out of them. So, in the 30 years that Russia's been a democracy, it's obviously been very difficult. And certainly you could make the argument very easily that Putin is not a democratically elected leader at this point, but that's sort of a lecture for a different class. Here are some pictures of Russia at this moment when they become Russia again, not the Soviet Union, flying the Russian flag instead of the Soviet flag. Again, here we have the Russian flag again. Statues of Lenin and Stalin and other major Soviet leaders were brought down. Here you see a woman sitting on a statue of Vladimir Lenin, bringing down all the images of the old regime. So some conclusions about this before we move on. The Soviet Union falls because of an unsustainable economy. They're fighting a 10-year war that's expensive, they're competing with the US for the arms race, and they collapse from within. And as I said before, there's no framework here for democracy, and that's the biggest reason why Russia has had such a hard time transitioning to democracy, is that there's no framework for political opinion. And even today that's true, right? So many of the people that have opposed Putin's administration have ended up dead in very mysterious circumstances. So people are still afraid to speak their minds, which is an inherent part of democracy. So we're still dealing with the ramifications of the Cold War today, even if it seems like it was, light years ago. It really wasn't. So now we're going to turn to talking about globalization and how, from centuries ago, the world has really just been on this path of becoming more and more connected. And I have this picture here. In January of 1990, the first McDonald's opened in Russia. And you can see this crazy line. Might seem kind of silly to us when McDonald's are everywhere, but this is the first one to open in Russia. And it was this first indication of globalization, really, but also for Russia entering that global market and world. Now, the end of the Cold War meant that the new sources of power and new social movements drastically changed politics moving forward. Perhaps the most remarkable was how much democracy spread towards the end of the 20th century. South Africa, Russia, Guatemala, elections now decided the fate of the country. In this sense, the world societies embraced the idea that people had a right to choose their own government rather than being under a totalitarian rule. Nevertheless, there was resistance. The most important holdout was China, and has been China. Now, Mao died in 1976, and within a few years his successor opened the nation's economy to market forces, so more capitalist. But they still resisted a multi-party system. Instead of capitalism and a Western-style democracy, they maintained that China would follow its own path into the modern age. By the late 1980s, economic reforms had produced spectacular increases in production, rising standards of living for many people in China. But the widening gap between the wealthy and the poor, together with increasing awareness of corruption within the government, triggered popular discontent. Worker strikes and slowdowns, peasant unrest, and student activism spread throughout the country. On April 22, 1989, some 100,000 people gathered in Tiananmen Square at the heart of Beijing in silent defiance of a government ban on assembling in large groups. The following month brought a greater show of defiance when TV cameras and world journalists converged on China to cover the historic visit of Mikhail Gorbachev from the Soviet Union. Several hundred students, flanked by thousands of supporters, began a hunger strike in the square to demand democratic reform. Tiananmen Square was now their stage, and the world had become their audience. Within days, the strike spread to other cities. In Beijing, where well over 1 million people filled the city center, a carnival-like atmosphere prevailed as they sang and they danced, and they just really brought attention to this movement. Here we have a picture. That's a picture of Mao that paint had been thrown on in Tiananmen Square, which was a huge mark of disrespect. But again, showing that they're angry. They want something new. They're not happy with the status quo. Now, the regime responded quickly by declaring martial law. Two huge protest demonstrations followed, and residents built barricades to defend the city against the army. So this is kind of all-out civil war. But by then, the government had assembled troops to crush the movement. And in a night of terror that began on June 3rd, the People's Liberation Army, so the Chinese army, turned their guns against their own people. Most students in the square negotiated safe passage, but there were an estimated between 2,000 and 7,000 people who were killed in this violence. And here's some images of the Chinese army's tanks rolling into the square. And again, they're using tanks and weapons against unarmed people. Now, people will adapt. They'll sort of use sticks or bricks. They'll make Molotov cocktails to try to fight back as best they can. Now, the Chinese government will weather this storm fairly unfazed. They would continue to suppress unofficial organizations. They controlled access to information, which continues today. And they cracked down on rebels and dissidents. Many people began to pay what little they had to be smuggled abroad at great risk and often with dire consequences in the hopes that they could make a better living in America or Europe, but a lot of times they were sold into slavery, specifically sex slavery. Within China, tens of millions of people lived a transient existence, with tens of thousands daily leaving the countryside for the cities in the hopes of a better life. And there they often suffered economic and social exploitation as well as government and police abuse. And what this shows us is that the promises of globalization and industrialization in the modern world are really distributed unevenly throughout the world. China at this point is becoming wealthier, more powerful, but that doesn't mean that that translates into a better life for everyone in it. And when people tried to push back against this, they were brutally suppressed by the Chinese government. So now we're going to talk about some global movements that may have started in several countries but have now made connections and become global. And before in this class, we've looked at the inequalities between men and women throughout 1815 to now, the period of our course. So if you're answering the other essay question on the final, this should definitely be in there. And we've seen how the women's rights movement has grown over the 19th and 20th century. While we've mostly seen this in the US and Western Europe, other nations also formed women's rights groups, many of them beginning in the 70s. In 1975, the first truly international women's meeting took place in Mexico City. 180, oh no, sorry, that's 95. I'll get to that in a minute. These meetings would continue up through one of the most famous ones, but certainly not the last, in 1995 in Beijing. The Fourth World Conference on Women brought in women from 180 countries and really became a platform for action where they were talking about women's rights in politics, business, education, and health. Alongside the official conference was a parallel conference for nearly 30,000 representatives at the NGO Forum for Women. So this is a huge, huge deal, garnered international attention. And these grassroots activists represented 2,000 non-governmental organizations from around the world. And what emerged from both of these conferences were associations and groups that began to lobby for the rights of women and girls across the world. So this is sort of a fitting end to our discussion of women's rights throughout our time period, that now it's gone global. Now women are not just working in their own country, they're working with women across the world. Now, while migration is a constant feature of human history, it has definitely become more pronounced over the course of the 20th century. Rather than the massive European immigration to the US, which had definitely been popular in the 19th century, after 1970, more Asian, African, and Latin Americans were on the move, not just to the US, but to many other places. By 2000, there were 120 million people moving from their country somewhere else to actually over 152 nations. So 121 million people were going to 152 different nations, which is absolutely staggering. And that was up from 75 million people moving in 1965. Most people were leaving poor nations for wealthier ones for a shot at a better life. So this is huge. I mean, I know in the US when we talk about immigration, we're usually just thinking about it in terms of the US, but this is worldwide. People are moving all around. And what this means is we see the dispersal of culture and the sort of merging of different cultures in a way on a higher scale than we had seen in many time periods before. Now, oftentimes globalization becomes equated with Americanization, that globalization means only the export of American culture, but that's incorrect. Globalization refers to the more interconnectedness of the world, which the internet has obviously helped with, but it also means cultures coming to the US, cultures mixing between the Middle East and Asia and Africa. That's what globalization really means. Part of this is due to media and technology. Technology is key to diffusing entertainment and the creation of more mass culture. In the 70s, for example, cassette tapes became the dominant medium for music, sidelining the record and the 8-track tape, which had come before it. Bootleggers illegally mass reproduced cassette tapes and sold them cheaply to people all over the world, especially in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, where they weren't allowed to have Western music. TV was also another globalizing force as American producers bundled old dramas and sitcoms and then sent them off for a pretty penny to stations worldwide. And this is why when you meet people from around the world, there's a good chance you actually have seen some of the same TV shows. Some of the really popular ones initially were Dukes of Hazzard, Frasier, Friends is always popular. I've seen Will and Grace in Finland, which was kind of cool. So again, there's a chance that you, if you've traveled abroad, you've probably seen this, or if you've met people from abroad, definitely now you have shows that are worldwide popular, like Game of Thrones and things like that. Now, America was not the only one to export entertainment. Brazilian soap operas began to make headway in Spanish language American TV markets in the 80s. Bombay also produced its fair share of programs for viewers in Britain. Actors from New Zealand, Australia, China, India began to find audiences in Europe and the US. So again, this isn't just the US, these are other countries doing this as well. American sports made a particularly deep impact as people across the world started watching and becoming fans. The NBA and Nike were particularly successful in international marketing, and it made Michael Jordan, in particular, the world's best-known athlete in the late 1990s. Soccer, or football, as the rest of the world calls it, has become an international passion. By 1980, soccer was the world sport. So sports, just like TV, also music, are integral to this, again, global connection between places. And this is why a lot of times you go to other countries, you'll see Bulls hats, Patriots hats, Red Sox and Yankees. They're everywhere because these various franchises have been really, really good about marketing them outside of the US. And also with TV and then the internet, there's a lot more accessibility to watching, games from these various teams if you're a fan, regardless of where you are. Even baseball, which is arguably America's sport, increasingly took on athletes from outside the US. Starting in the 1960s, the number of Latin American players on US teams began to increase. The Dodgers also began recruiting Asian players as well. In the 90s, as LA experienced a growing Asian immigrant population, the Dodgers signed the Japanese pitcher Hideo Nomo. Also, players from the Dominican Republic, like Sammy Sosa, became incredibly famous. And you see this absolutely even more today in baseball. Players from around the world, especially Japan, but also the Caribbean as well, becoming more and more high-profile players. Now, migration helped drive world cultures as well as technology. As people moved around, they brought also their own musical tastes and borrowed others. Reggae in particular was born in the 1960s among Jamaica's Rastafarians and became a hit sensation in London and Toronto, where large West Indian communities had migrated. Reggae lyrics and their realist imagery invoked a black countercultural sensibility and a redemptive call for the return to African roots, a sense of pride in that culture. And Bob Marley and the Wailers sort of are the most famous of this. Bob Marley really takes reggae on a world tour literally and makes it popular outside of the Caribbean, in Europe, the US, etc. In northeast Brazil, where African culture had emerged from decades of being looked down on, Bob Marley became a folk hero. In South Africa, he became a symbol of resistance. And this is very popular. Whether you like reggae or not isn't really the point. The point is that this music spoke to a huge diaspora of people, and reggae actually propelled a shift in African American music here in the US. In broadcasting reggae, DJs merge sounds and chant lyrics over a beat, a form of music that we now know as rap. Now, this was a disruptive concept in the late 70s, but within about a decade, rap became a club favorite and certainly took on more and more popularity in the US. Rap lyrics emulated reggae music by focusing on black problems, but they also opened a new domain of controversies involving gang worldviews and basically the situation of African Americans in the US at that moment. The effects of migration on global music were also evident in Latin American transformations of North American music genres. Latin music came into its own thanks to Latin American migrants who were moving around and brought that music to the US. In New York and New Jersey, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans popularized salsa and merengue. In LA, Mexican ballads became pop hits. And we certainly have lots of Latin American stars today who are part of this tradition. Now, world culture may have become more integrated, more and more connected, but that doesn't mean that the more and more we have sort of a global culture, it doesn't mean it replaces national or local cultures, as I'm sure you all well know. Tech and migration often reinforce the appeal of cultural icons as national celebrities gain popularity, whether at home or abroad. As the market for world cultures grew very competitive, there was more room for different types of performers and performances. Among the breakthroughs that occurred since the 70s was the triumph of black performers like Bob Marley, Whitney Houston, and of course, no one can now deny the power of Jay-Z and Beyonce. You also have black athletes like Michael Jordan, writers like Toni Morrison, among so many. And those are just American examples. There are world examples. The same. I also have Oprah up here. I mean, nobody can deny the power of Oprah. Competition also began to shatter some biases based on gender. You have women becoming these very, very wealthy and powerful performers like Madonna and Cher, Beyonce, Lady Gaga, those two more recently. Not to mention, we have female writers like J.K. Rowling becoming one of the most well-known and wealthiest female writers of the late 20th, early 21st century. You also have female politicians like the American First Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, oftentimes referred to as the notorious RBG, which I kind of love. You also have more and more, into the 21st century, more and more LGBTQ artists coming to more and more prominence. And this is all definitely part of globalization. And again, I've given a lot of American examples, and there's certainly many non-American examples as well. So, to cap off our class, now to back us up a little bit, in the 1200s, a few travelers ventured over long distances, like Marco Polo, and communications and technology was what we would now consider rudimentary. The world was much more a series of communities set apart than a world bound together by culture and communication. But by the late 20th century, that balance has now clearly changed. Food, entertainment, clothing, family life have been increasingly similar across the world. In 2000 and into the 21st century, local culture lives on, but there's an increasing presence of global culture and global access. As humanity has harnessed new technologies to accelerate the exchange across and within culture, an even larger gulf separates those who participated in these networks. The more and more connected we become, the more and more wealthy parts of the world become, unfortunately, we've also seen a sort of parallel increase in the disparity between the rich and the poor in the world. So the more and more we presumably move forward, the more and more challenges we still have to deal with. What I hope you've gotten out of this short class is that history is way more than names and dates. What I've tried to show you is that over, in our case, 1815 to now, history is a series of interconnected events across time and place. The world is way more interesting and complicated than we often think it is. And I hope that you've at least been opened to that idea, even if you don't necessarily a month from now remember all the intricacies of this. I hope you come away with that. Namely, that nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything that you're experiencing in your life today, politically, culturally, socially, has a historical root. And if you think about that and you research those historical roots, you can very often much more understand what's going on right now than if you didn't understand the history behind it. Nothing in the world or in history is black and white. It really is 50 shades of gray, to use a very terrible phrase. But that's very important to remember, that human beings, human history is very complex, and it's all brought us to the point where we are right now. So understanding that is incredibly important. And the last thing I would say to urge you as you move forward, even if you don't take another history class, is to question the world around you. When news outlets or politicians or whoever claim history as their own, do your own research, be an independent thinker, question that. Because that's what historians do, and that's such a good skill to have whether you become a historian or not. So question the world around you. I hope you've learned something very interesting in this course, and I look forward to reading your final exams.